Hello, welcome to live version of Amiga Vibes. Still some debugging ongoing. I noticed that the title updater didn't work, but yeah, we should be on live now. The first track was Project X 1999 remix by Alistair Primble. Yep, let's see. Everything is changed after the first recorded show, so let's see what happens. Yeah, it's getting spring here in Finland also. We had 2 days winter again, or actually 3 days. We got a few centimeters snow on Thursday, and it was around 0 or below 0. But now today it was again around 10 degrees, so getting warmer. And next Wednesday it should be around 18 maybe, so doesn't need to wear the hoodie anymore. Yeah, let me play the next track. Okay, something's happening. Next is Entity and The Amiga Never Dies. Let me find the correct button somewhere. Maybe not. Yep. Entity and the Amiga Never Dies remix. I lost the title already. Yeah. I choose to play that because Amiga OS got updated last week. It was 3.2.3, if I remember correctly, and already updated my emulator setup, but still to flash the image on the real Amiga 1200. Yeah, I do take requests. You can request from slay.radio/request and join the conversations from slay.radio/discord. I will try to follow the discussion while the tracks play, but I try to get on to the train with all the things moving. Let's see. Okay. Let me play one more my tracks. Let's see. I have a little time to find out the requests. Next up is Dango with Lotus 1-to-1 remix. Dango with Lowe's 1-to-1 remix. Yep, getting things done here. FS is if you can confirm the right remix. I sent you a DM. Okay. So FS was the first requester for the show, and let's see. Request was hyper-based Enigma, but I'm not sure which remix. Let's see. Yeah, I put the purple lights here because I think Cactus was requesting that, so it was kinda the first request. I'm not sure if Cactus is around. I don't really had time to read the chat properly yet. Yep, and I'm gonna, like I said, I have pretty much totally different setup from the first pre-recorded show. Different buttons and 2 computers and 3 screens and things, and I'm trying to hook up the Amiga here to the thing. I'm gonna try something, but let's see. Yep. But in the meantime, while FS is looking for the right remix. Okay, yeah, found. So it's Amok and hyper-based Enigma. Yeah. Right. Yep. So this is Amok hyper-based Enigma. Amok hyper-based Enigma. It was requested by FS, the very first requester for my show ever. So I wanted to play that. Even I had to wait some time. Yep. I have some slight issue with the camera setting. I'm using my phone as a camera, and every time I connect it to my laptop, I get that reaction icon on the top bar there. And with that, you can like zoom and set the background blurriness and stuff like that. But for some reason today, it doesn't show up the icon. I didn't have time to reboot the machine, so yeah, you can see some puzzles and whatever there. I couldn't crop the image, but yeah, anyway the camera works, so I think it's enough. Yep. Actually, I could play one thing now. Slagon has done. Actually, there was something from Slagon. Let's see. Yeah, Slagon told that on Twitch, Proton has reached 15 stream streak. So, congratulations for that. But yeah, Slagon has been working with the setup, helping me and so on. So I have one clip that I doesn't know that I got recording of that. It was from unknown user, so I'm expecting. I think that might be Siona was recorded the audio clip, so let me play that for you. So I'm not sure if this from the 1st of April when the first show was aired and there was pretty much everything wrong, or is it from this week some platform? Let's see. So yeah.
Jeesus, saatana! Vittu! Jotta saatanaa muka! Ei mikään me saatana kohtuudella! Jäi saatana jäätyy vaan tällä, kun ei vittu täällä saatana! Tulisi ite laittamaan saatana huoltoukot! Keksinneet saatana! Tämä ei sovi tuohon lähtemään, kun... Ei saatana! Voi Jeesus, miten laitetaan! Ei, kun se ei ota sinne. Mikä saatana sitä pitää kiinni? Tämä päin vittua.
Yeah. So, but I think everything is now working pretty much okay. So, thanks, Slagon, for that. Let's see if we have. Yeah. Next request. Let me find that. Yeah. Next request is by Tiffy, and he wanted to hear Crystal Hammer Mulberry remix by Mulberry. So let's see. Yep. Crystal Hammer remix. Yeah, took the Amiga, got it hooked up. Maybe I need to check that soon. So there's this one. Let's see. State of the art demo. So let's try to play it like OG version from diskette, and the setup is from composite, so let's see what happens. The visual quality might not be the best one, and it's hard for the headphone listeners because of the stereo separation. But yeah, but before that, let's play one more track if I can find it. Yeah, Spavach was requesting a Terrican tune or remix, my choice. So I chose the Terrican medley 1-3 main theme by Mano. Mana with Turkan medley. 1 to 3. Okay. Yeah. Something weird is happening. Anyway, yeah, let's try next play this one. So, yeah, one moment, please. Or actually, let's do this way. Yep, seems to work. With wrong title. Nope. Some slight issues here. Maybe. Okay, let's try it again. Right. It played all the way. That was the second time I tried that from the diskette. So good that it works. Yeah, I had a slight issue with the audio settings first, and then I think the bed was running in the background also in the beginning. But yeah. Next up, we have a request from ZDuder, and he wanted to hear Supercast 2 DJ's choice of version. So I selected the Fast Loaders version of Supercast 2. Supercast 2 by Fast Loaders. Yeah, great track. Thank you, Cedar Dude, for requesting the supercars. SDK commented that I have heard Barry Leeds play this live on keyboard. Yeah, that must have been great. Yeah, Proton sent me a message that he has something exclusive work in progress, I think. Let's see. Well, at least unreleased. I'm not sure if it's finished or work in progress. But yeah, Stardust Memories. So let's play that next. Proton and Stardust Memories. Yeah, I hadn't analyzed that yet, so the levels was a bit low at the beginning. Yeah. I had a little cold end of the last week and beginning of this week. I wasn't sure if I can make the show, but feeling okay now, and the voice is back to normal. Also, some slime in the throat every now and then. Yep. Next up is Ziana's request, and she wanted to hear. Okay, let's see. Mirko Hirsch with Follow the Sign. So let's line up that. Mirko Hirsch, Follow the Sign. Yeah, that was a nice track. I have listened that at least once because in January when I started to think about this show, I actually downloaded all the tracks from AmigaRemix.com and during the work days I have been playing all of them 1600 something tracks, so but I didn't remember that. Yeah. It was election day in Finland today. Well, we voted for the local city councils and welfare area council. Haven't checked the results, haven't had time to do so, but yeah. Other things I have been doing, I have this, let me see. Bought some key switches from, well, these are Kyle boxed switches, brown, tactile, and did some 3D design, made my own, I don't know what's the part called, but okay, it doesn't want to focus. But yeah, changed the internals from the switch, and this is a Mitsumi keyboard keycap, so it will now fit that. Almost worked. Yeah, but I was planning if I can do some mechanical keyboard for Amiga by designing the internals, but the resolution makes some challenges to get it work nicely. Yeah, but let's see. Next up, we have a request by Amiga de la Amiga. Request was Fast Loader's Turkan 2 Traps featuring Chris Helsbeck, and apparently this was from Back in Time Live 2018. Yep, let's try again. fast loaders with Chris Hulsbeck Turken to traps. With long applauses. Yeah, in addition to elections today, it was obviously Palm Sunday, and in Finland there's a tradition that kids put on witch clothes and go around the doors like in Halloween in the US. Well, they give those what is it called? Trees, no, branches with feathers or other ornaments and get candy. Except that on the west coast where I live, the tradition is different, and it happens next Saturday. It's actually the two traditions are mixed, and so it happens on different time on here. So no witches on the doors today, but next Saturday. And my daughters are planning to go around the blocks and gather candy. I think my older daughter, who's 13, got like 2 kilograms candy last year. So let's see what's the result this year. Yep, and I haven't lined up the next request. Let's see. Next request was by Lord Evil. Request was Dr. Future with Future. No, Dr. Future, Shut Off the Bees. So, let me find that from the list. There. Right. So let's see if this gets played correctly. Dr. Future with Shadow of the Beast 2 came over, and it was requested by Lord Evil. Thank you for that. And if you want to hear your request from Selected Radio / request, I don't have too many tracks on the list right now. Right. But next up, we have a request by Buzoi. The request is Dusty, or XX Dusty XX, Abidja, Meadows Edge. And Dusty with Abidjan Meadows Edge. It was requested by Buzoy. Thanks for that. Yep, I'm getting low on the request, but let's say I had one from Testicles and I forgot to copy it. It was mod converted to MP3, so I need to download that. One moment, please. Should be here. Yep. Okay. Yeah, I lost my mouse pointer a while ago, and I just realized that I have an iPad on the table with the controls for the mix software, and actually the mouse went on there, so didn't remember that it is possible to do that. But yeah, let's see. Okay, takes a while to load it because it's coming from another laptop where I have the Discord client. But yeah, this is Doom screen. Okay, module. So let's listen to that. Alright, Doom module. I don't have the artist name right now, but thanks Testicles for requesting that. And actually, I think last time I played Doom was on my Amiga 1200. So yeah, familiar sounds there. Yeah, actually, the reason why I haven't updated the latest kickstart for my 1200 is that I have the Terrible Fire 1260 turbo card in it, and using the IDE connector from that, so I need to make a custom kickstart that has that driver for the IDE port in that turbo card. My plan is to hook up the 1200 to this system so I can play the modules and stuff from original Amiga hardware, but I need a couple of things more to get this thing to work with the 1200. Next up, we have a request by Bolo, and he wanted to hear Firefox and Cream of the Earth. Firefox, the Dirty Drummer remake versus Romeo Knight. So let's have a listen to that. Firefox Cream of the Earth, Firefox Dirty Drummer remake versus Romeo Knight. Yep. And Doom Artist was the track was Doom and Stuff version 4 by HDH. Alright, next up we have a request by SDK. He wanted to hear Parallels Lotus 2 main theme, and I don't know if he wanted to hear the original, but anyway, I lined up the remix by Zudi or something like that. Actually didn't line up it properly yet, it seems. Now, let's have a listen. Zudi with Lotus Turbo Challenge 2. Yeah, great track. The original and the remix too. A bit problem with the mixer or mix and handling the things here. I'm doing this with the Auto DJ feature this time, and the first show I did those fades and things manually, so I'm losing the control every now and then. Yep, we have 90 minutes left, so I think there is room for a couple of requests still on the list. Next up, next track or next request is by Like a Lemming Died for the Very First Time. It sounds something familiar there, but won't sing it. He or she wanted to hear Exxon and Lemmings medley remix, so let's have a listen to that. Exxon and Lemmings medley remix. Nice tracks. The Lemmings game or games have, I think, if I remember correctly, the Lemmings 2 tribes had a kind of remixes of the tracks that the first Lemmings had. Or actually there might be that there was also different things now that I remember. There was like some Beach Boys tracks or similar to those, and yeah, don't remember correct. I haven't played Lemmings for like decades, I think. Good game though. Yep. Next up, I decided to play some Peter Clark. The track is Guitar Slinger Plus. Peter Clark with Guitar Slinger Plus. Yep. Getting dry mouthed. Luckily I have a water bottle next to me, but yeah, 9 minutes left. There is 2 requests, so I think I'm good. Yep. Next week it's Easter. I get my brother with his family visiting us Tuesday and Saturday, and traditionally we have gathered to my oldest brother's home to Easter bonfire, but I think there's no bonfire this year because reasons, but anyway we are gathering there. And of course Friday off, so 2-4 work days, weeks coming ahead. Nice to get a bit more free time. Next in line we have a request by Segara42, and the request was Dream Time, the Turken 2 main title Dusk Mix. Turken 2 main title Dusk mix by Dreamtime, and it was requested by Segura42. Alright, time for one more request, and then it's my time to go to sleep. The first and the last request was or is by FS, and the second request by FS is LFF Skid Row Crack Throw song, Tyrus edition by Tony Fluke 73 Viren. And remember to switch to Fluke's stream. He's streaming Amiga music all April. I think he started half an hour ago, so 2 tracks and you can change to that. But yeah, here's the track. Yep. Sorry, lost the thing and forgot to update the stream title, I think. Yeah. Tony Fluke, 73 VN and LFF Skid Row Crack Throw Drum. But I did get one more request, so I'm gonna play that. So Gazoo wanted to hear Hired Guns remix. So I lined up the remix by O Super Ego. Hired Guns Awesome Mega Blast. Yep, that was Hard Guns by Super Ego. Awesome Mega Blast remix. Thank you everyone for joining. I think it went much better than I thought. A little bit hurry all the time, but still nothing catastrophic failures happened, I think. I haven't checked the schedules yet, but remember to tune also to Buzz Radio. I think tomorrow is Mats Monday. It's on its way. Okay. Tuesday, Cactus. Wednesday, I think that was some British, Swedish guy. Don't remember her name. His name. And then on Thursday, of course, CNN Slaycon is gonna make a show, I believe so, if I remember correctly. And so I might take a couple of weeks break before the next show. At least not gonna do show next Sunday, and maybe not after that either. But yeah, the target is to do 1 or 2 shows per month, so you will be noticed when the next show is coming. Let's see. Yep. That's all. The one tune I have selected, Awesome A with X out or cross out, like I heard it should be said, as the game says that, I think at some point. And actually I played the game last week. Decided to try. I'm not a shoot 'em up player, so this high score track was very often played, like every 15 seconds or so, because it's played even if you don't get to the high score lists. But yep, thank you. Goodbye. Have a lovely next week, Easter time. Bye bye.